This is part 2 commentary on the book Wealth, Poverty, and Politics by Dr. Thomas Sowell. And so in this commentary, we want to understand if climate, geographic location, diseases, do these things have influences on the achievements of people and their success? And some people may think that it doesn't, but let's think about that again. And so what happens when groups become isolated because of their geographic location? Or what about when groups live on lands which don't have very navigable waterways, or they live on lands that are not very fertile, right? These and many other factors do have influences on the outcomes of people in very different ways than people who do not have these same types of geographic handicaps. So let's go ahead and open up the book, right? And go ahead and get us some understanding.
No society has had a monopoly on discoveries and inventions that have advanced human beings. So a given set of people, whether a class, a race, or a nation, to be in touch with what other peoples around the world are doing has been a major advantage, and to be isolated a major disadvantage.
And so what does it mean that no society has a monopoly on the discoveries and the inventions that have advanced human beings? That means that a person can't just point to one particular society and say, they are the ones that are responsible for any and every invention that has advanced humans, right? Because that's just not true. You may have one group that has certain inventions, such as the East Indians with the numbering system, and then you may have another group with certain inventions, such as writings coming from the Sumerians. And so societal advancements require both of these unique inventions as basic building blocks, and they came from two distinct societies. And this is one of the reasons why it's important for groups to be in touch with what other people are doing so they don't miss out, right? Because no single group is responsible for the advancement of human societies.
A larger cultural universe is important not simply because of the products, technologies, and knowledge that are transferred back and forth, important as these are, but also, and perhaps more important, because people seeing repeatedly how things have been done differently by others in different places can break through the normal human inertia that keeps people doing the same things in the same familiar ways for generations or even centuries, as happens in many geographically isolated societies.
It's important to be able to see how other groups do things for the simple reason that they may have acquired some knowledge which allows them to do a thing in a better and a more productive way, right? For example, the people from ancient Greece were able to see examples of agricultural production in societies in the Middle East and then adopt those practices for themselves, but only after recognizing that those practices were much better than what the Greeks were doing at that time, right? But this type of transfer of knowledge could only be effective if groups were in proximity of other groups, right? But what happens when other groups were geographically isolated?
When the Spaniards conquered the isolated Canary Islands in the 15th century, they took over people of a Caucasian race, living much as people had lived in the Stone Age. Similarly, when the British discovered the isolated Australian Aborigines in the 18th century. In other isolated settings as well, whether in distant mountain villages or deep in tropical jungles, peoples have been found living as others had lived in earlier centuries or millennia.
The Spanish in the 15th century found people in the Canary Islands living as if they were still in the Stone Ages, right? And the Canary Islands is a small island off the northwest coast of the continent of Africa. And the Stone Age for most of the world ended around 5,000 years ago. And so why was this group still living in such a way, right? One of the main reasons is due to isolation, right? They didn't have access to the accumulated knowledge that was being built up in different parts of the world, right? Where people were sharing knowledge amongst each other and creating more complex technology, right? And it was the same thing for the Aboriginals in the 18th century. They were found living as people did in a much earlier period, right? And Australia is another one of those land masses in a region that's away from the hub of where civilization was developing. Right. And it's not like the people are dumb. Right. That's not the case. These people are highly intelligent in their specific environments. Right. But they were isolated and didn't have access to what the rest of the world was doing. Right. And so the lesson in this is that there's a price to pay when groups cut themselves off from the entirety of the rest of the world. Right. So let's get some more.
Deserts are another geographic factor isolating peoples. This incomparably vast desert, slightly larger than the 48 contiguous states of the United States, has been for centuries the largest single factor isolating the peoples of sub-Saharan Africa from the rest of the world. The dearth of good harbors in tropical Africa also limited contacts with overseas cultures. As Fernand Braudel put it, external influence filtered only very slowly, drop by drop, into the vast African continent south of the Sahara.
You'll notice that it stretches across a vast area of land, right? And that it's a huge desert larger than the mainland United States of America. And it was responsible for isolating the sub-Saharan Africans from the North Africans and the Middle Eastern groups, which possessed a greater storehouse of knowledge and technology in particular areas. And so they were largely cut off from the outside influence, which was one of the causes that left them vulnerable to later invasions. Now, the land location and deserts were some of the major causes which caused people to be isolated from others, but waterways also played a significant role in this as well. And so waterways are not only used as a source of drinking for humans, but also as a source of transportation of goods and people from one place to another, right? And certain rivers being more usable than others, depending on how smooth the water flows, right? The depth and the width of the water, and if the water cascades and if it plunges into waterfalls, right? And depending on these factors, waterways can decrease or increase the access to other people, right? And they can also increase and decrease the cost of transporting goods in and out of particular locations, right? So here we go.
Even after the creation of motorized land transport, the differential cost of land transport and water transport did not disappear. In 20th century Africa, the estimated cost of shipping an automobile by land from Djibouti to Addis Ababa, 342 miles, was the same as the cost of shipping it by water from Detroit to Djibouti, 7,368 miles. Looked at differently, where there has been a lack of navigable waterways, accessibility to the outside world has often been severely limited, shrinking the cultural universe drastically, and with it shrinking the opportunities of peoples to connect with other peoples and cultures far away. In some cases, a dearth of waterways and the presence of geographic barriers meant that people living only 10 or 20 miles from each other often had very little contact. This was especially so in places lacking horses, camels, or other beasts of burden during the many centuries before modern transportation and communications developed.
Now, hopefully we're getting a better understanding on how these geographic locations are influencing the outcomes of people, right? If it's difficult to physically access other people, then it shrinks their access to the wealth of knowledge that humanity as a collective has developed, right? And it has profound effects, which we have seen throughout history.
One of the remarkable facts about the continent of Africa is that although Africa is more than twice the size of Europe, the African coastline is shorter than the European coastline. This is possible only because the European coastline twists and turns, creating many harbors where ships can dock, sheltered from the rough waters of the open seas. Moreover, the coastline of Europe is increased by the many islands and peninsulas that make up more than 1/3 of that continent's total land area. By contrast, the African coastline is smooth, with few substantial indentations, few good natural harbors, and fewer islands and peninsulas, which make up only 2% of Africa's land area. The ratio of Europe's coastline to its area is 4 times that of Africa. Moreover, the coastal waters around sub-Saharan Africa are often too shallow for ocean-going ships to dock. In such places, large ocean-going ships must anchor offshore and have their cargoes unloaded onto smaller vessels that can operate in shallow waters. But this time-consuming process and the greater amount of labor and equipment required has been more costly, often prohibitively costly. For centuries, seaborne commerce between Europe and Asia sailed around Africa and seldom stopped. Even in those few places where large ships can enter Africa on deep rivers, tropical Africa's coasts have narrow coastal plains that often end abruptly against escarpments. One important consequence of this shape of the land is that, even in places where ships can enter the continent on African rivers, they can seldom get very far inland before being confronted with cascades and waterfalls. For the same reason, boats coming from the vast interior of the continent are seldom able to continue out to the open sea, as boats and even large ships can do in various places on the Eurasian landmass or in parts of the Western Hemisphere.
So Africa has these massive waterways which are not very ship friendly because they cascade and they develop into waterfalls, right? And obviously this severely limits the navigation of ships, which in the past and in today's times has been a setback, right? But understand this, that just because it has had a negative impact in the past, it doesn't mean that it will continue to in the future, right? When other applications for this geography are put to use, right? So for example, there are hydroelectric dams being built in Africa where the renewable power is generated from these waterways in the form of electricity, right? And the Grand Ingham Dam, if completed, it'll be the world's largest hydroelectric facility in the world, right? So understand that a situation that may be a hindrance in the past, it may be of an extreme use in the future if the appropriate knowledge is discovered and put to use, right? But up until this point, the African waterways have been a setback, whereas the waterways in places like China have not. So let's listen up here.
By contrast with Africa, China has had a huge network of navigable waterways, described as unique in the world, formed by the Yangtze River and its tributaries, as well as an indented coastline full of harbors. What was also unique were the centuries during which China was the most advanced nation in the world, on into what were called the Middle Ages in Europe.
China has had a huge network of water that could be used by both boats and ships, right? The Yangtze River being one of the most useful waterways to this day. And Dr. Thomas Sowell talks about how the Yangtze River could accommodate ships weighing 10,000 tons up hundreds of miles up this river, right? And you can imagine just how much goods could be transported compared to a waterway like that in the Niger, which during the dry season in this part of West Africa could only accommodate ships weighing no more than 12 tons. Right. And so there's a huge difference between 10,000 tons and 12 tons, right? Which demonstrates one of the major points in this book, that it's unrealistic to expect equality of outcomes when there's no equality in the geography of people's inhabitants, and also a whole host of other influences which also contribute to the outcomes of people. Right. And so another geographic influence that Dr. Thomas Sowell discusses in this book are the general outcomes experienced by those people who inhabit mountainous regions, right? Poverty, illiteracy, lack of education. These are what he discusses as the commonalities amongst the mountain people, right? And he also talks about how these people were negatively viewed throughout various times in history and throughout different societies, right? And how other people just didn't want to have much to do with them, right? And he gives this example here in America.
There was much the same resistant attitude toward mountain folk in 20th century America, as shown by press reactions when large numbers of mountain people moved into urban communities. Such resistance was exemplified by the reactions of the Chicago Tribune, as noted in a scholarly study of migrations from the mountains. The hillbillies were described as a degenerate population with the lowest standard of living and moral code, if any, and the most savage tactics when drunk, which is most of the time. National publicity followed, with stories in Time, Look, and Harper's, the latter under the headline, "The Hillbillies Invade Chicago." That article's subhead gave away the racial slippage. The city's toughest integration problem has nothing to do with Negroes. It involves a small army of white Protestant, early American immigrants from the South, who are usually proud, poor, primitive, and fast with a knife. The message was clear and intentional. These people are worse than the colored.
They called this group degenerate, right? With very low standards and almost no moral code whatsoever, right? And these mountain folks were supposed to be worse than the blacks, right? Now, what does this tell us, right? And remember that these same whites migrated from the South, right? And this is what we discussed in the commentary on the book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals, right? And also in a book called The Cracker Culture by Dr. Grady McWhiney, right? They brought that culture with them and tried to settle in the urban areas of Chicago, and the news spread quickly that these people were quick with the knife, right? We're talking about a difference in culture that's making people respond in this manner, right? Those people didn't want any association with people who were known to be quick with the knife, right? And they had a very different moral standards than what those other people brought with them from that old South, right? Just like most of the people watching right now, you wouldn't want to be around them either, right? No matter what skin color that they had, right? And so let's talk some more.
The parallels with blacks go beyond the responses of others. A 1932 study of white children from small communities in the Blue Ridge Mountains found that these white children not only had IQ scores slightly lower than the national average of 85 for black children, but also had IQ patterns similar to those of black children, such as doing their worst on abstract questions and having IQs closer to the U.S. national average of 100 in their early years, with a widening gap as they grew older. Such similarities were especially striking because blacks were far more rare in southern mountain communities than in the South as a whole, making genetic interactions far less likely.
And so we can see that this group coming from the mountain areas scored less than the blacks in terms of IQ. And what this shows is how the environmental and cultural impacts influence outcomes. Now, should we expect people from the mountain areas to have higher IQs? Probably not, right? What good does it do for them to be good at abstract questions when they're living in a society that doesn't use that type of information nearly as much as people living in urban communities, right? But if we were to take those same people and place them in the same environment and give them the same culture as those other people who performed high on the IQs, then we could expect with reasonable certainty that they would have performed just as well. Right. And so it is with the blacks, right, who also score low on the IQ test. Right. Different environment, different culture, different results. Right. And that's all that we can expect. And so we can see how these various geographic factors have contributed to the isolation of different people and what has been the outcomes of such isolation. And so Dr. Thomas Sowell provides many, many more examples in this book, and too many for us to go over in this video. But he also goes over temperature, climate, and disease, and how in many parts of West Africa, many animals that were used in other parts of the world to carry large loads could not be properly used in West Africa because they have this disease-carrying fly called the tsetse, right, which was prevalent, and it prevented livestock from being developed, right? And this tsetse fly was a torment until about the 1960s, when humans finally created a means to put this thing under control, right? And so the prevention of mass numbers of livestock in West Africa is one of the reasons why you see people carrying those loads on their head, right? Because having a large beast is simply a much more effective way of carrying a bunch of items than humans, because animals like camels and cows and other heavy-duty beasts of burden can carry much more for a longer distance than a human can, right? But this is just another example of the influence of environment and how outcomes should not be expected to be equal when we live in a world that is designed in an unequal way, right? And so this is the end of part 2 commentary on the book here, Wealth, Poverty, and Politics by Dr. Thomas Sowell. And stay tuned for part 3, where we're going to be discussing cultural influences which shape progress and success, right? So I want to thank you for watching until the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you on part 3.